Hey Wafters, Mr. Lassiter with you, and in this video we're going to be looking at the foundations of Indian civilization. We've already talked about the Indus River Valley, ancient civilization, but we're going to move a little bit closer to modern times and of course into our time period. So we're going to be looking mainly at the years 1500 to 300, 1500 BCE to 300 CE. So here we go. So foundations of Indian civilization. Let's see what we can find out here. First of all, let's start off with with geography and a map of the Indian subcontinent so you can see what we're talking about. India has three topographical zones. The northern zone, the first one, is the mountainous zone. Second, we see the Indus River Valley and the Gangetic Plain, basically these river basins. And the third is the peninsula. So again, first one up here, mountains, then we have the Indo-Gangetic Plain, and then the peninsula of India. The Vindhya Mountains and the Deccan Plateau divide the peninsula from the other zones. So here are the Vindhyas and the Deccan Plateau. The peninsula itself includes further topographical subregions, including a tropical coast in the west, the Coromandel coast in the east, a flat area of Tamil in the south, and the island of Sri Lanka, the southern tip of the Indian subcontinent. Peninsular India and the Ganges Valley have a subtropical climate and plenty of rainfall. And the Indus Valley is dry, and agriculture there relies mainly on irrigation. The staple crop of the Ganges Delta is rice, where elsewhere the staple crops were wheat, millet, and barley. And that just goes along with the type of climate they have and the amount of rainfall. The geographical diversity has made it very difficult in India for political power to unify all of India for any great period of time. So throughout history, we're going to be talking about some empires in India, but certainly not as many as we'll see dominate other regions of the world. India, for the most part, because of its geographical diversity, is just extremely hard to unite and build a powerful state. After the demise of the Indus Valley civilization, we enter the Vedic age. And in this age, Indo-European warriors migrate into India. They were organized into patriarchal families and kinship groups, and they herded cattle mostly in the northwest of India after they came through the Hindu Kush mountains. After about 1000 BCE, some of them began to push into other areas of India, such as the Ganges Valley. They would use new iron tools to cut trees and cultivate land. And they brought with them also an oral tradition, including Vedic hymns or their traditional religious hymns. There were also, excuse me as I catch up here, there were also violent struggles that they told of in their oral traditions between themselves and the darker-skinned peoples who were eventually pushed into southern India. Now, I do want to mention that there are challenges to this belief of what's called the Aryan migration or Aryan invasion of India. And so that's something we might have time to touch on, and I think I did a little bit in class. But the struggle between the Aryas and the Dasas, or this Dravidian-speaking peoples, led to the development of a system, or a class system known as the Varna. Basically, it's an equivalent word to class. Under this system, people were born into one of four Varna. Those were the Brahmin, or the priests and scholars, the Kshatriya, or warriors, the Vaishya, or merchants, and the Shudra, or the peasants and laborers. A fifth group, known as the Untouchables, was outside of this system, and it usually consisted of persons who did demeaning or work that was deemed dirty, like dealing with dead bodies of animals or humans and cleaning up waste, etc. These four Varna were even subdivided into hereditary occupational groups called jati. And it's basically known by the Portuguese word for caste, right? This is the caste system. So jati were arranged in the order of hierarchy. There were complex rules that governed the appropriate occupation and duties and rituals of each jati or each caste. And they laid forth regulations concerning the interaction between peoples in these different groups. The belief in this extreme social hierarchy was rationalized by a belief in the Vedic tradition of reincarnation. And according to this belief, each human had an immortal spirit, or an atman, that would be reborn into another body after death. And one's station in life depended on one's actions, whether or not they fulfilled their duty in life or their dharma. And fulfilling that dharma could build up good karma in your life, and you would be reborn into a different caste, hopefully a higher caste if you fulfilled your dharma. The Vedic religion emphasized the worship of male deities through sacrifice. Religious knowledge and practice was the monopoly of the Brahmin priestly varna. So we see this priestly class basically be completely in charge of rituals, prayers. They had memorized hymns, and they even opposed the introduction of writing to the masses, because that would challenge their own authority. If more classes could learn how to write and could learn these rituals and prayers and hymns, then obviously that meant that other people could possibly interpret these. And so that would challenge their own authority at the top of the social ladder. We don't know a whole lot about the status or roles of women in the Vedic period, but we do know they could study, they participated in rituals, they could own land, and they usually married in their middle or late teens. During the Vedic period, though, people began to react against this rigid social hierarchy. You can imagine if you were in the bottom of this social hierarchy, how you would feel. And so they started to react to it and react to the religious monopoly of the Brahmin. And so some people even withdrew from society and went off kind of into the forests and wilderness, where they sought ultimate enlightenment. They would pursue salvation through things like spiritual and mental disciplines such as yoga or special diets. And their goal was to achieve moksha, which is liberation from the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. And their ideas of these dissidents became compiled in another set of texts called the Upanishads. And so these religious texts represent people outside of the traditional Brahmin or the traditional hierarchy who are searching for this enlightenment. And that's going to add a great deal to a change in this Vedic tradition. But this brings us to another tradition that develops during this time, Jainism, which is founded by a guy named Mahavira, who you see pictured in this painting from the 1800s. The people who practice Jainism practice extreme non-violence. That's probably the best way to describe it. They went to extremes in their attempts to not kill any living thing. The most extreme even went around naked, and some would even starve themselves to death in kind of this extreme asceticism. The less extreme devoted themselves to other things like commerce and banking. Other occupations that didn't require them to kill. In some cases, they would even sweep the paths in front of them so they'd make sure they didn't step on any insects or any living thing. But one of the biggest challenges, or maybe the biggest challenge to the old order of the Vedic traditions, was Buddhism. So Buddhism is founded by Siddhartha Gautama. And his title, the Buddha, basically translates into the enlightened one. Basically, Siddhartha Gautama had been a wealthy young man. He was a member of the society. He had experienced the caste system, and he just was alienated by the extremes of the wealthy youth and the amount of people who were just poor and destitute in society. And so went off and kind of searched for this idea of enlightenment. What was the true path? And he develops this kind of philosophy along this Four Noble Truths and an Eightfold Path. And this was believed that it would lead to an individual to true enlightenment. And some of his followers even took vows of celibacy, nonviolence, and poverty in order to achieve full enlightenment. The original form of Buddhism centered on the individual's attempt to gain enlightenment through moderate living, self-discipline, and meditation. This would achieve enlightenment. And if they achieved ultimate enlightenment, they would achieve nirvana, release from the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, or reincarnation, which is very similar to the Vedic traditions and Hinduism, because it's coming out of the same traditions, same areas. According to Buddhist teaching, we see challenges to some of the Vedic beliefs. Especially the social hierarchy and the importance of the Brahmin caste, where you have these people having a monopoly on religion. Instead, this was a much more personal, individual path to enlightenment that did not require these educated elites to carry out the rituals. Following the death of the Buddha, some of his followers organized themselves into monasteries and nunneries. They developed a complex hierarchical religion. In some cases, we see the worship of Buddha, reverence for bodhisattvas, and artistic representations of the Buddha. And it breaks down into two major schools. The first being Mahayana Buddhism. Mahayana Buddhism incorporates new beliefs into what the Buddha taught. So we see this kind of widening the scope of Buddhism. It's not quite as strict. For example, Mahayana Buddhism will take off in China and will incorporate aspects of the Chinese religion, whereas Theravada Buddhism followed the original teachings of the Buddha much more closely and was a much more strict and narrow path for Buddhism, which we see starting to develop in this time period. Of course, the Vedic traditions give rise to the religion of Hinduism. And it begins with kind of reforms after there are pressure from new religious movements like Jainism and like Buddhism. And so as a result of the reform, the foundational elements of the Vedic tradition incorporated things that were popular in these other religions: intense personal religious devotion, fertility rituals, symbolism of multiple cultures, and even elements of Buddhism itself. Sacrifice becomes less important while the role of personal devotion to the gods increases. Okay, so something that was more like Buddhism and less like maybe the Vedic traditions. As part of the reform, two formerly minor Vedic deities take a place of honor in the Hindu pantheon. And these deities were Vishnu, the preserver, and Shiva, the destroyer. And so these are among a lot of other gods, kind of countless other gods and goddesses that were all understood to be manifestations of a single divine force. Hindu worship centered on temples and shrines, that included service to deities, and it also included pilgrimage. For example, the Ganges River became one of the most popular pilgrimage sites, as it was considered holy and a river that was cleansing and could basically cleanse a person of their sins and set them on the right path, etc. Of course, the religious duties of people in Hinduism would always vary depending on their gender, social status, and age. So the social status is still going to stay in place. The caste system will still stay in place. And we see this transformation from the Vedic religion to Hinduism was so successful that Hinduism became the dominant religion of India. Hinduism appealed to the common people's need for personal deities where they could have a direct connection to the gods. And it interacted with Buddhism in this region as well, because while Theravada Buddhism, or this narrow path of Buddhism, was usually too strict to have popular appeal, Mahayana Buddhism was so close to Hinduism in some of its beliefs that they could actually be absorbed by Hinduism. So many people who Buddhism would appeal to, when Hinduism starts to develop much more, they just incorporate those Buddhist beliefs, and therefore people kind of stay closer to this more traditional religion, Vedic tradition, which transforms into Hinduism. All right, guys, that's it. Sorry I went on a little long. Rewatch if you need anything. Make sure to go back through your notes. Remember, these are supplements to the notes you've already taken for your book, so if you already got something written down, don't bother to write it again. Hope you have a good day, and I'll see you in class tomorrow.